for us to reflect and pray for those who have died today, and indeed all the innocents who have died around the world and who have been unjustly killed. If you could just take a moment to pray for them and reflect on the nature of our lives and what we are meant to do here and where we are going. Thank you. So I'm looking around the room, and I feel such joy. I see members of our Hub Foundation, friends and family who are here bringing your energy and your enthusiasm. And it's amazing to see how we are coming together to weave this beautiful tapestry of community together, one event at a time, one day at a time. And I also see so many new people here. And I feel so excited to meet each of you. And I hope that you take a moment to come up and introduce yourselves to the team so that we can get to know you. Our purpose here is to grow community, and that happens one relationship at a time. The Hub Foundation aims to gather and uplift positive voices of Muslims and indeed people of all faiths who are committed to the ideals of seeking knowledge, loving thy neighbor, and serving humanity. Our Hub Talks are a forum for leaders, scholars, artists, and luminaries to raise consciousness. And through these programs, we seek to amplify the voices of conscience, ultimately dedicated to creating a more peaceful and just world. We have some exciting changes at the Hub Foundation, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome Sayeda Jaffrey as our new executive director. She will be leading the foundation and formalizing our strategic grant making. She has a background in philanthropic collaboration and has helped build One Nation with philanthropist George Russell. She has a background in international development, Mideast policy, leadership studies, along with degrees from NYU and the London School of Economics. She speaks several languages and has worked overseas extensively. She's keenly interested in issues relating to Islam, the American Muslim community, and spirituality. Sayeda, welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Hub Talks. Thank you, Sarah, for the kind introduction. Sarah is leading two of our cornerstone programs here at the Hub Foundation. One is the Hub Talks, and the second is the Innovative Scholarship Program. She is an attorney who comes from a public interest background focusing on women's rights, immigrants, and Muslims. She sits on various boards and is engaged in the community at large. We at the Hub Foundation plan for a very exciting 2020 of grant making, of strategic impact-oriented grant making in particular, aiming to raise the consciousness of humanity, lift humanity in areas of underserved women, civic engagement, interfaith, intrafaith, and continued leadership development and dialogue. Without further ado, I would like to welcome everyone to the program. Thank you for being here.
And on to tonight's program, why Muslims are vital to American progress. So for me, this story started about 10 years ago. I was on the board of a local masjid. For those who know me, it's ICCNC. And we were re-envisioning our mission statement. We were going back and forth in that boardroom trying to figure out what we wanted to set as our new objectives. Should we say that we propagate Islam through our programs? Should we say that we adhere to Islam through our programs? Honestly, these words fell flat to my ears because the ideas behind it fell flat to my ears. Suddenly it dawned upon me, that we needed to change the conversation. Instead of merely following and adhering or propagating, we needed to celebrate Islam and our role as Muslim Americans. And our mission statement needed to reflect that. I won't forget the way everyone in the room kind of paused when I said celebrate. 10 years ago, that sounded a little foreign to everyone. But given the innovative organization that it was and is, everyone quickly adopted this word because the ideal of celebrating Islam and Muslims reflected what we wanted to embrace. So here we are, over 2 decades, and our larger Muslim American community has been trying to convince the world of what we are not and who we are not. The language has been a language of mere tolerance at best. Let's take a step back. Let's realize we have defined ourselves using purposeful, limited terminology, selected and defined by others. It is time for a paradigm shift, and it is time to change the conversation. As Muslim Americans, we need to understand that we are not pleading for a seat at someone else's table. This table belongs to each and every one of us, and especially to all our youth. And we need to remember that we are bringing something vital and deeply meaningful to this table. This research-driven conversation between Dalia and Craig will highlight the myriad of ways that Muslim American contributions are reshaping the landscape in every field, from innovation, technology, prosperity, health, well-being, just to name a few. Let us remember that these contributions need to be celebrated, and that celebration must start at home. Without further ado, I introduce Dalia. Dalia Mogahed is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. She was the former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. With John Esposito from Georgetown University, she co-authored the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. President Barack Obama appointed Dalia Mogahed to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. She's been invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations about U.S. engagement with Muslim communities. Her 2016 TED Talk, if you haven't seen it, please go and listen, was named one of the top TED Talks of that year. She is a frequent expert commentator in global media outlets and international forums. Please join me in welcoming Dalia Mogahed.
Thank you so much. I want to first thank the Hub Foundation for having me, its leadership, its volunteers, and for being such gracious, amazing hosts. I also want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules on a Sunday night to be here to have this important conversation. I want to first start by introducing myself, telling you a little bit about who I am and what brings me here, what brings me into this moment. I was born in Cairo, Egypt, and I came to the United States when I was 5 years old with my family. My parents met in Cairo University's College of Engineering, where my mom was one woman, the only woman, in a class of 10,000 students in the School of Aeronautical Engineering. My mom and my dad met in college, fell in love, and later got married. One thing they shared is their absolute passionate love for education. And they made that very clear to us as we grew up, where education was about as important as oxygen in our home. So I know none of you know what I'm talking about, but when we would come home with a 98% on a test, of course the obvious response was, what happened to the other 2 points? We grew up learning and knowing that very high standards were expected of us, that nothing could stand in our way if we worked hard enough. And so I grew up knowing and believing that I could be anything I wanted to be if I dedicated myself to it. I also grew up unsure exactly of where I belonged. I was born in another country. I was being raised in Madison, Wisconsin, so a little bit of a climate change there. If you've never been to Wisconsin, we have 9 months of winter. And I was kind of unsure. Was I an Egyptian in America? Was I an Egyptian American? Was I an American at all? And so it was really a pivotal moment in my life when I stumbled on a book in my high school library when I was 15 years old. Now, this is at a time before I was familiar with any Islamic conferences, or that this idea of a Muslim American identity was even introduced to me as a thing. Madison was a pretty small insular community. We just weren't tapped into the national scene. So I stumbled onto this book in my library, and to my surprise, it was about a civil rights leader that shared my faith. And I actually did not even know there was such thing as a history of Islam in America. I thought it was a completely new thing, that it basically arrived on the shores of America, on the airplane that we came in. And as I started to read this book, I was transformed as I read about Malcolm Little turned Detroit Red, turned Malcolm X, turned Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. As I read about the transformative power of faith in the life of this great American civil rights leader, it transformed me. How many of you have read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Raise your hand. How many of you would say that it transformed you? I have never met someone who has read that book and it didn't change them. For me, it was almost like a rebirth. It was what birthed in me a passion, a deep passion for social justice, and a realization that I could and should be sourcing that passion in my faith. And so Islam suddenly became something that I wasn't just inheriting, but something that I was deliberately striving to understand. And so I started to read the Quran, this time as an explorer, as someone who was reading to truly understand, to truly embody, to understand what was my Lord asking of me. And as I did that, I didn't just passively read the Quran. I have always been a pretty irreverent, I'll just put it that way, young person at heart. I challenged things. I asked a lot of questions, and I did that with the Quran. I questioned, and I reflected, and I doubted, and I ultimately believed. Because what I found in this book as a young person were real answers to questions I had about what it meant to have justice on earth. What did real freedom look like? And it was through this spiritual journey that I came to the decision when I was 17 years old to start wearing hijab. This was where one of the manifestations of that journey. And I remember, as someone who was known as a feminist and a human rights advocate in my school, I was told that a friend had said, in my absence, of course, behind my back, "Why is she oppressing herself?" And for me, that was a really strange way to see what I had just done or what I was deciding to do. Because for me, it was, as a young young person, 17 years old, it was a feminist declaration of independence from what I felt was an oppressive societal pressure on women to conform to a specific standard of beauty. For me, it was a defiance of that pressure. And look, there are advantages, as many of us know. For example, whenever we travel, we're almost guaranteed a full body massage care of TSA. And then people just stop me in the street and give me compliments. Like when I'm outside in the summer and it's really warm out, people will just come up and say, "You look hot." And I'm like, "Thank you. I have been working out." So in all seriousness, this was an empowering moment for me. But in some ways, it was also a heavy responsibility that I think we put on women who choose to be visibly Muslim that maybe is unfair. Because what I took upon myself is this unreasonable responsibility to represent at every moment in my life. And that weight of representing 1.8 billion people in everything you do can be crippling. So for example, I studied chemical engineering. I did say I was Egyptian, so that is a redundancy. Yes, I am an engineer by training. So as a chemical engineer, I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's one of the top schools in this field, and it was a very rigorous, difficult curriculum. And they sort of practice this education through humiliation strategy, where tests would be returned face up in alphabetical order on the table for you to pick up, right? So everybody saw everybody else's grade. And I was supposed to be the best because I had to be the model minority. I had to be the counter stereotype. I had to be good at engineering because I was supposed to be oppressed and uneducated. So when I wasn't the best, which I almost never was, there were some really smart people in my classes with me, I felt like I had let the Ummah down. It is dehumanizing to try to be a mascot all the time. And I think we have to relinquish that. So fast forward, throughout my college years, I was also an activist. I organized around the Bosnia genocide, against the sanctions against the Iraqi people. I organized around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You can tell when I went to college by some of these issues. And when I left, I graduated and I joined corporate America like a good engineer. That all quieted down, and I was living an individual, normal life, got married, had a baby, living the Egyptian American dream. And then that horrific morning on September 11, 2001, changed everything. And I think anyone who was old enough to be there knows exactly where you were on that morning. I was eating breakfast, getting ready to drive across middle America to go to grad school. And when we saw what horrors were unfolding on TV, we decided to change our plans and not drive until the next day, just simply not knowing what was happening in our country. And I remember driving from Cincinnati, Ohio to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was going to be starting business school, and being actually afraid for my safety. For the first time in my life, afraid that to be recognized as a Muslim. And I remember moving into a duplex that day, the next day after September 12th, 2001, and being scared, being worried, not knowing what our neighbors would think. This was a brand new city. No one knew us. And that Friday was the first Friday that we would be going to Joma. And I wasn't sure what to do. We had warnings that people, I think you might remember, there were warnings that issued that first Friday that it might be a target for backlash. And so we were trying to figure out what to do. Should we go to the mosque? Brand new city, we don't know what to expect. Are we gonna have angry protesters there? Are people going to be, could it be a target? And so it was a question that we had to deal with an infant, brand new city, and we decided that whatever might be at the mosque, whatever might happen, we can't live in our own country afraid to practice our faith. Whatever we might find, we had to go to the mosque. It was a matter of deciding what kind of an America we were going to be okay with, what kind of an American we were going to be from here on out. Whoever just attacked our country attacked our country. And we weren't going to live as if it were any other way. So we drove tensely and silently to the mosque that day. And what I saw in that musalla changed me. Because half of the congregation on that day were people of all faiths and no faiths, who weren't there to protest or attack, but to stand in solidarity with us. And honestly, I just broke down and cried. And it was this moment, it was that moment that I rededicated my life to building bridges, to making what happened in that mosque multiply and be the reality for our country. That we could be called to a different kind of principle, to a different kind of aspirational America. And so fast forward from that day, I now have the privilege to live out this mission as the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where I direct research on American Muslims and the challenges and the opportunities that face our community. And what I have observed is that for almost 2 decades, sisters and brothers, we've had the wrong question posed to us. And we've been stuck in a perpetual loop of answering the wrong question. And here is the wrong question that has been posed over and over and over. Are you a threat or are you benign? The doctors in the room know that when you discover a tumor in your body, there's only one question. Is it benign or is it malignant? Now, if it's benign, which is the best case scenario, you either, extract it just to be safe, remove it from the body just in case, or a really progressive doctor will just keep it under surveillance. Just watch it. See if it changes. Now, a malignant tumor, there's no conversation. You just got to get it out. You just got to extract it or take medicine to remove it from your body. And so the question, especially around election time, is what are you? Are you harmless? Can we trust you? Are you going to help with national security? Are you a benign tumor? That's like the that's like the those are the allies. Or are you a cancer in the body of America? And some have been, open enough to just to actually use that language and use that imagery. Because what do you do with that? You remove it. You ban it. You criminalize it. Why are both responses incorrect? Because it is the wrong question. And we can no longer answer the wrong question. Because Muslims are not a tumor at all. We are a vital organ in the body of America. We belong and we contribute. So as a researcher, I can talk about this, but where's the evidence? Where's the substance behind this paradigm shift? Well, we decided to do a rigorous documentation of this question. To do this work in a truly rigorous way, where you're not just kind of throwing around numbers, estimates, you have to take a region of the country, because what we physically did was we went and looked at archives, looked at patents, studied economic patterns, looked at how many entrepreneurs. You can't do that nationally all at once. So we looked at Michigan as a case study to start. We also did New York City. This project of ISPU is called Muslims for American Progress, or MAP. And the Muslims for American Progress research project came out of this paradigm shift question change of, no, we're no longer going to prove we're benign. We're in the business of looking at this community as a vital organ. So we looked at a number of sectors and wanted to quantify in numbers, in dollar signs, what would Michigan look like if it lost its Muslims? Okay? So to start off, Michigan's Muslim population, unlike popular perception, it's not 50% Muslim or 70% Muslim. No, it's 2.7% Muslim. That is all. Michigan is not a majority Muslim country, okay? 2.7% Muslims live in Michigan. That's a population percentage of Michigan that is Muslim. But 15% of the doctors in Michigan are Muslim. Muslims create more than 100,000 jobs in the state of Michigan alone, and that exceeds the jobs created by the Chrysler Company. A company, known for being this great American brand that the government bailed out using billions of tax dollars because of its vital necessity to our economy and its job creation. Muslims in Michigan create more jobs than Chrysler. Muslims have registered more than 1,400 patents in Michigan. They contribute $5.5 billion to the economy. That is what Michigan would lose every single year if Muslims didn't call it home. They also donate more than $10 million in charitable giving every year. On average, Muslims spend and contribute more to the economy, by 20% more than the average person, especially when it comes to spending on education. They educate more than 20,000 students as teachers. They represent the constituents of more than 200,000 people. A Michigan without Muslims would lose all of this. Pound for pound, Muslims contribute more than their numbers. But there's another story that I have to tell you about, because it would not be complete without this part. Though Muslims are an economic engine for our country, in terms of innovation, in terms of entrepreneurship and job creation, in terms of contributions to the economy, our community is also the most likely, largest percentage of us live at or below the poverty line of any other faith community. How many people in this room knew that? It's not a well-known, it doesn't match sometimes our image of ourselves as this model minority. All of these things are true at the same time. All of these things are true at the same time. We also have poverty as a problem within our community, and it has to be part of the same conversation. We have to pull the whole community up. So when I say it's a vital organ, it doesn't mean that it has no flaws. It doesn't mean that it has no challenges. But as a vital organ, its health dictates the health of the body. The health of our community is a condition for the health of America as a whole. And the health of America as a whole is a condition for the health of our community. There is no separation. There is an interdependence. See, some people get upset when I talk about Muslim contributions because they are uncomfortable with the idea of being a model minority or projecting this idea as if there are no flaws, there are no problems. And I am here to say we do not have to be perfect to be equal. And we get to be human, not just mascots, not just overachievers, not just the best in our class. Some of us can be average too. And some of us are poor, and some of us are struggling. But we still get to be fully human, fully American, and fully equal. We should never fall into the mistaken trap of thinking we have to be twice as good just to be equal. That may be the reality, but we have to keep challenging that reality. And so where are we now, sisters and brothers? We're in a moment in our history where we are called to, by our faith, to not be okay with the realities around us. The reality of our country right now is that we are truly at a crossroads. This next election, as much as we say this every time, but I'm serious this time, this next election is historical. We can't afford to do anything except work every minute of every day to do our best to channel our country to its better self, to call our country to its better self, and to call ourselves and our community to our best selves. How do we do that? And I'm going to close with a few very basic recommendations. We strengthen our democracy, first of all, by educating ourselves. By educating ourselves about the challenges facing our country and our community. By educating ourselves about who we actually all are. A lot of times I travel across the country, and the Muslim communities I speak to are themselves not educated, are not aware of our own reality within this country. What are the challenges facing us? Who are we as a community? We're both unaware of our contributions and our challenges. So we have a responsibility to educate ourselves. And then we have to be truth tellers. We have to be a tribe of truth tellers, because it will take a tribe of truth tellers speaking together to drown out the voices of falsehood, which are a well-funded, well-organized industry. By doing that, we have to and must exchange fear for facts. You know, here's the thing about fear. This is on a neurological level. When we are afraid, and this is borne out in any study you do, when you are afraid, when you and I are afraid, something happens in our brain where we are more likely to accept authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice. 3 things that erode the very foundation of our democracy. So we strengthen our democracy when we help people trade in their fear for facts. And then finally, and most importantly, democracy only works when we participate in it. We cannot allow ourselves to stand on the side. We have to become engaged in the process. At the bare minimum, we all have to be registered to vote and actually vote. Muslims, and I'm talking about eligible voters, this does not include people who cannot vote. Among our eligible voters, we are the least likely to be registered to vote of any faith community in America, and that must change. So in closing, and I look forward to your thoughts, Muslim Americans have so much to offer, but we cannot start to give until we ourselves change the paradigm of the question we should be answering. Thank you.
Thank you for your illuminating talk, Dalia. Dr. Craig M Considine is a scholar, global speaker, media contributor, and public intellectual at Rice University. He is the author of many books and articles. His opinions have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, CBS News, MSNBC, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy. He holds a PhD from Trinity College at the University of Dublin, a master's from the University of London, and a bachelor's from American University. Dr. Considine is a U.S. Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. Peace be with you all. Assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to be here. Dalia, thank you so much for the inspiration and for the motivation, and of course for everything you do at ISPU and beyond. I think we're all thankful for the work that you do, and please keep it up. Before I get started, a few thank yous are in order. Sarah and Sayeda for organizing this event, thank you so much. To Sam for making all of this happen. For each and every single one of you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here, and of course to our Creator, for none of this would be possible. I want you all to get comfortable because we're going to start using our imaginations for the next 10 minutes. Is that okay? Everyone's cool with that? We're going to use our imaginations a little bit? Okay, good. I want you to imagine that the next 10 minutes is like a story in a book and this book has yet to be published. So picture it as a draft of sorts. When I'm finished in 10 minutes, all of us collectively will figure out if this book should be published. So get loose, open the mind, breathe in and out. Are we ready? Okay. You sure? Okay. Okay, so the story starts something like this. A 19-year-old young man who has never met a Muslim in his life and knows practically nothing about Islamic traditions enrolls in a Islam 101 college course with a hope of being an intelligence officer. The young man is not a complete Islamophobe, but let's just say he had some pretty questionable ideas and thoughts. On the first day of this Islam 101 class, the young man enters the classroom to see an older professor, a brown man, an immigrant, and someone who identifies himself as a Muslim. Now remember, for this young man, this was effectively the first Muslim that he had ever met in his entire life. As Islam 101 proceeds, the Muslim professor starts to rock this young man's heart, his mind, and his soul by showing him a side of Islam and Muslims that is never seen in the media. As the months and years progress, the Muslim professor welcomes the young man into his small circle of researchers. And over the years, the Muslim professor continues to influence the young man's personal, professional, and spiritual growth. This Muslim professor even takes the young man on countless journeys across our beautiful country, the United States, in order to improve relations between all the people who call this country home. Throughout their travels together, the professor and his student journey into the homes, the places of worship, the schools, the businesses, and the neighborhoods of Americans of all walks of life. The Muslim professor even introduces the young man to some of the most brilliant minds in the country, including Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Noam Chomsky. The young man would never have been able to participate in any of these travels if it were not for a generous $15,000 grant from a Muslim organization in the middle of New Mexico. It was certainly a generous gift, and the young man was thankful. But the journey of this young man with his Muslim professor was not always smooth sailing. One time, the young man was assaulted in Washington, D.C. He was smashed in the face with a pint glass and suffered facial injuries that required 2 surgeries, which was followed by another plastic surgery. The doctor who put this young man's face back together just happened to be Muslim. The young man had another life-threatening experience on this journey in Hollywood, which is not too far away. He was at the home of a Muslim businessman to screen the documentary that he and the professor were working on. Within 5 minutes of the screening, an unexpected allergic reaction occurred, and the young man had to be rushed to the hospital. And guess who took care of the young man at the hospital? A Muslim. At this time in his life, as a 22-year-old living off a small grant, the young man had absolutely no health insurance. As you know, having astronomical health care bills and with no health insurance is certainly a recipe for disaster. But what happened next was a beautiful act of charity. The host of the film screening, the Muslim businessman, covered the bills of the young man because this Muslim man was passionate about helping those in need. Now, everyone's still with me? Our imagination's still open, good. Eventually, this young man decides to clip his wings, and he decides that he needs to journey without his Muslim professor as his guide. The young man decides to move to Europe, where he reaches out to Muslim communities of all backgrounds. in the hope that he could meet with them for research purposes. And they end up welcoming him with open arms. Over the years, the young man dines with Muslims, prays with them, dialogues with them, laughs with them, cries with them, marches with them, studies with them, and travels with them. Together, they collectively experience the joys and the struggles that are so common among all human beings. One particular family became like family to the young man. He spent countless hours in their restaurant and their mosque. He learns about the dynamics of their culture and their unique Islamic practices, which reminded him of his own ethnic and religious backgrounds. The young man grew to not see these Muslims as research objects or participants, but rather as fellow human beings who have a wealth of knowledge about our Creator and ideas on how to contribute to the betterment of our communities. Upon his return to the United States, the young man takes up a position at a university where he decides to teach a class called Muslims in American Society. In this course, the man brings countless numbers of Muslims to the classrooms who happen to be community leaders, activists, imams, athletes, and so on. The students in the course interact with the Muslim communities around them, and these students introduce the man, who is no longer particularly young, to many more Muslims who further enrich his lived experience. The draft of this book stops here, at least for now. Perhaps you haven't figured it out by now, but if not, the young man in the story is me. These stories, believe it or not, really did happen. And the Muslims discussed here have actual names, faces, and stories of their own. You see, my work as an educator, a scholar, a public intellectual, or whatever you want to identify me as, is simply not possible, and nor were any of the previous experiences that I mentioned possible without the selfless contribution of Muslims. Now think about this. If it were not for the Muslim professor, I would have never fallen in love with knowledge. If it were not for the grant of the Muslim organization in New Mexico, I would have never traveled throughout my country to learn about Islam and U.S. national identity. If it were not for the Muslim businessman in Hollywood who paid my hospital bills, I could be buried in debt. If it were not for the Muslim family, I would never have completed my studies. If it were not for the Muslim surgeon in Washington, D.C., I could have a mangled face. And if it were not for the Muslim doctor in Hollywood who dealt with my allergic reaction, well, I may not even be here. Quite simply, Muslims are part of who I am and who I wish to be. They are my past and they are my future. They are my family, they are my mentors, my role models, my friends, and most importantly, my brothers and sisters in humanity. And for all of us here tonight, each and every one of us, Muslims are our school teachers, professors, doctors, lawyers, charitable givers, students, community activists, entrepreneurs, bus drivers, cab drivers, secretaries, social problems workers, psychiatrists, athletes, artists, musicians, bankers, public intellectuals, political figures, politicians, and so on. In short, Muslims in the United States contribute everywhere, to everyone, and to every realm of American society. They truly make our country go round. Now that you've heard about these personal experiences and views, let me point out that these personal experiences do not exist in isolation from my scholarship and the books that I have published. When I see a poll in the media that says U.S. Muslims are highly educated, I naturally think of all the Muslims and the teachers who have guided me and continue to inspire me to gain more knowledge. When I see statistics that reveal that U.S. Muslims believe in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, I naturally think about my friends who speak about their appreciation of the U.S. Constitution and the rights that they provide. When I see a book that highlights Prophet Muhammad's love of humanity and vision for a pluralist world. I reflect on the panel events that I have sat on with Muslims who also speak about the Prophet's greatness. And when I see news stories on interfaith relations, on Muslims standing arm in arm with other communities who are also facing difficult circumstances, I am reminded of the times that I locked arms with Muslims on the streets. So the findings and the conclusions of all of these various academic studies do not merely exist as theories or abstract ideas. They are real life. They are facts. People like myself and so many others recognize the contributions of Muslims because they have experienced them at interfaith gatherings, the vigils, the hospitals, the schools, the businesses, the community centers, the grocery stores, the places of worship, Hub 925, and so on. People in this country feel the contributions of Muslims in the lovely emails or text exchanges, the hugs, the collective tears, the social media posts of solidarity, and even the common greetings of peace that we hear so often on a daily basis. So when we consider our lived experiences, at least in the context of what I have just shared with you, we see stories of humanity, compassion, tolerance, pluralism, civic values, mercy, thoughtfulness, solidarity, belonging, inclusion, diversity, and community building. These are the kind of values that can transform our country, but also our very existence as human beings here on earth. These are the stories that are worth telling, and as such, they are certainly the stories that are worth publishing. Now, to return to what I said at the beginning, is this book worth publishing? I think so. Okay. So, Dalia, again, would like to thank you so much for the inspiring talk and for all of the research that you've done at Pew and ISPU. I was telling Dalia when we had the opportunity to meet for the first time in person, actually. This is the first time we've met in person. I greatly value Dalia's research, and I've quoted this many times in my own work. And, you know, we wish you nothing but the best in the future years. God bless you, Dalia. So what we're going to do now, we're going to have a conversation, a guided conversation. We have some set questions that will kind of spark the conversation on contributions that Muslims have made, continue to make, and will likely make in the future years ahead. But we'll also keep it kind of loose and organic, and we'll kind of take it where we wish to take it. And then we'll open this up for Q&A. So we're going to engage with each other in conversation for about 35, 40 minutes. Okay?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So our first question is, how does your research, not just at ISPU, in general, how does it engage in the celebration of Muslim contributions to humanity? I kind of touched on some of them. They were quite personal, but in terms of your research, how are these contributions celebrated?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful story that you told us and for sharing that with us. I think in our work, we strive to essentially just do one thing really well, which is to make sure that any conversation or decision concerning American Muslims is well informed. And within that mission, it means we have to ask the question, what are Muslims contributing? Not simply, who they are not, but what they are. And we celebrate Muslim contributions by showcasing and sharing. So, for example, in our work with the Muslims for American Progress research project, we have this photo exhibit that looks at not just the hard facts, but the human faces of Muslim contributions. How many of you saw the photo exhibit as you were walking in? Okay, great. So that photo exhibit has been displayed in coffee shops around the country. It's been put in different galleries, in schools, at museums. You know, one museum that I was really proud of is the Michigan Science Museum, where they had an exhibit of 1,001 inventions. If you're not familiar with the exhibit, it's this wonderful traveling exhibit of a celebration of Muslim contributions historically. You know, the inventions of Muslim civilizations, the contributions to our lives today, things like coffee. You know, how America runs on a Muslim contribution, right? But we wanted to take that conversation to the present, that this isn't just a historical phenomena, but that Muslims continue to contribute to the well-being of our country today. And so we had this, we celebrated Muslim contributions by taking this exhibit and this presentation into the Science Museum for thousands of people to see. So what we do is we don't just discover these things, but we educate and we equip folks on them. Another thing we've done is we've taken these contributions and taught educators about them, school teachers. We know that 42% of American Muslim families with kids in the K through 12 school system report their child has been bullied sometime in the past year for their faith. It's the highest percentage of any faith group. Muslims are the most likely to be bullied for their faith of any faith group. And a quarter of those bullied are bullied by their teacher. So there's a need to educate the educators on a different question of what Muslims contribute.
I think it's really important for educators or teachers out there in the audience, you know, if you are engaged in research that might have public value, that it might be of interest to the public, you have to find a way to kind of translate some of these statistics and these reports into something that is digestible to people. And we were talking about this earlier in the back room, you know, like what is the point of carrying out all of these studies if it's only going to get into the hands or into the minds of, you know, other intellectuals or academics? It's really kind of no use in that regard. I mean, it's still of use, but like we want to change the way society is actually operating.
Exactly, and I was demoralized to find out that the average journal, academic journal article is read by 7 people.
Yeah. That's depressing.
It's
actually.
totally
Yeah.
depressing. So we strive to not actually publish in academic journals. What we're trying to do is get it out to those who need it to make better decisions, to the public, but especially to decision makers, to change makers, where that information will help them make better decisions on the ground.
I'm curious, Dalia, like what, over the years, you've been obviously engaged in this research consistently. What is like one of the most surprising contributions that you've come across over the years?
You know, these numbers blew my mind actually as much as they do anyone who I share it with. I was not expecting the numbers around like contribution to the economy, $5.5 billion. I mean, that's huge. That is a number that, you know, in one state from one community, it makes a huge difference. It's a real dent, and it's an important number to have when you're advocating for the community. I think one thing that I learned when I served on the President's Advisory Council in 2009 under President Obama on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships is I learned the difference between influence and access. So access is something, and influence is something completely different. And where I was confused, and a lot of us, I think, mix it up, is we think if we have access, that means we have influence. And that's not the case. We had a lot of access to the Obama White House. I would argue more access than we've ever had to any White House ever, and of course since, obviously. But did we actually have real influence? Not really, in my opinion. And why? Because we weren't able to come to the table with frankly, organized money and organized people. We were not coming to the table with, here is what I bring to this table, and here is what I can offer, and here's what I will take away, and this is my agenda. We didn't do that. We hadn't done that homework. So when we got the access, it didn't translate into influence because we hadn't done that homework. And so I think that being able at least to quantify what our community brings to the table is a very important part of building political power.
So you need access again, and then you'll be able to influence.
Yes. Well, someday, yeah, if there is ever inshallah, 4 more years at least, but that's my prediction. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but after that, inshallah, we might have access again, and then by then we will have done all that homework in order to actually have influence.
Yeah, it's a good point. Difference between access and influence. I think that's an easy thing to kind of take away from this evening's event. So a lot of the research that you've been carrying out is focusing on the modern context. What about the contributions that Muslims have made throughout history? Because we know, in some of the research that I've done, this country has never existed without the presence of Muslims. In fact, Muslims were on U.S. soil long before this country even existed. So they've always contributed, but obviously if you go back into history, it would be really hard to kind of get the resources to kind of quantify this. But have you dug into the history to look at like where, how, in what context Muslims have contributed to the prosperity of this country over time?
So we do have ISPU scholars that are historians, and they focus just on that. And there has never been an America without Islam. There has never been an America without Muslims. Not only is it inaccurate to say America is a Judeo-Christian country now, but indeed it never has been. I'm not the best at conveying that. My research is in the modern context. What I know is just sort of general reading, but we know things like Islam was carried to this country in the hearts of explorers, of enslaved Africans, and of immigrants from all over the world. Muslims fought in the Civil War. They fought in the Revolutionary War. To erase our presence is to deny history. And I think it's an important point. There's a couple of reasons why I think it's so important to know that history. One is you need to feel whatever your background happens to be, that you are a co-owner in this project, that you're not a guest, and no one should ever, and you shouldn't allow anyone to make you feel like a guest on anyone's good graces. You are just as much a part of the story as anyone else. That's one. And I think another one that's really important is for many of us, non-black Muslims, which is most people in this room, including me, of course, we need to have a certain amount of appreciation for the contributions of black Muslims. Because when we talk about Muslims being here since the beginning, the vast majority of those Muslims were black Muslims. And it was that contribution that we are building upon as a collective community today. And I don't know that we have enough awareness and appreciation for that in our community as a whole. And so I think understanding that history will do two things. One is hopefully bridge some of our own intra-Muslim, fractured relations along race lines by building awareness of contributions within our community. And second, it will also help all of us feel a greater sense of ownership and a stake in this project called America.
Yeah, and I think to kind of piggyback on what Dalia is saying, when we look at the history of Muslims in this country, going back to the importance of facts, a lot of this stuff is factual. Like, I'll give you one example. Charles Wilson Peale in the 18th century during the American Revolution was arguably the most important painter in this country. A lot of the stuff that you might see in some famous museums, a picture of Washington or Jefferson, was painted by Charles Wilson Peale. But there's also another famous painting of a man named Yarrow Mahmoud, who lived in Washington, D.C., and he happened to be a revered member of the Georgetown community. Also, if you're wanting to dig in a bit deeper into the early history of Islam in the United States, as Dalia mentioned, it really does start with African Americans. Sapelo Island. Has anyone visited Sapelo Island? It's a treasure trove of history. And we had, I had the opportunity to visit with the professor that I was mentioning in the story on the day that President Obama was inaugurated. And it was a fascinating kind of linkage of history. But the woman that we were interacting with, her name is Cornelia Walker Bailey, God rest her soul. She passed away a couple years ago. But she was I think the 10th descendant, 10th generation descendant of a man named Bilali Muhammad. And some of Bilali's historical documents are preserved in the University of Georgia Library. So like these aren't, like, oh, like Muslims may have been here. No, like this is real. Like they're primary documents. These are hardcore facts that I think the public needs to know about. Another question, Dalia. The research that you've been carrying out, it is kind of traditionally academic, but in what ways does your research kind of embody Islamic values and Islamic traditions, especially as it pertains to kind of humanity at large?
So thank you so much for that question. So it gives me an opportunity to sort of explain the institution and then me as an individual and maybe what the differences are. So ISPU as an institution is not a religious organization. It's a research organization that happens to study Muslims. So we are not an Islamic organization in that sense. But and some of our staff are Muslims, some aren't, some of our board is and some aren't. We're a multi-faith staff and board. But for me as an individual and for me coming into this work, I am animated and inspired by so much of Islam's calls to action. And one verse that especially, it may surprise you, that really invigorates me when I am doing this work is it's a verse in Surah At-Takwir which says, describing the day of judgment basically, and one of the things that will happen on the day of judgment, إِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, and it's saying when the girl infant is asked for what crime she was killed. And what always strikes me about this is, of course, a reference to a pre-Islamic barbaric practice of burying girls alive. But what it says to me is, on the day of judgment, on the day of justice, the silenced will be given a voice. Because it always struck me, why is she being asked why she was killed? You know, why isn't the verse talking about her father or her family who did this to her? Because she was never given a chance to talk. She was never given a chance to speak. She was silenced. She was silenced in all these different ways, and on that day, the silence will be given a voice. And what inspires me about the kind of research that we're able to do is we are able to give people a voice who don't have access to the megaphones, who don't have access to places of power. But by being able to capture their voice in a representative survey, capture their voice in good research, to be able to convey the reality of who we are to the world, we're able to give the silenced a voice. And so that inspires me every single day, to be able to be a truth teller in a world where falsehood has a lot more money.
That's powerful. Certainly empowering. And you know, from my own personal perspective, a lot of people ask me, how did you start studying Christian Muslim relations and Islamic studies? And as I mentioned in the story, it really did start with a professor who happened to be Muslim, who happened to be talking about Islam. But it was so much bigger than that. It was about the power of the mind and how fragile the mind can be to kind of absorb information or propaganda that is not good for the heart and the soul. And it was about knowledge. It was about truth. It was about how can, when I saw the light that he was sharing, I felt empowered. And for one of the first times in my life, a field of knowledge had opened, and I said, wow, education is certainly the way forward. And I think that kind of resonates with what you're saying about the power of knowledge to empower us and to transform us. What about your team at ISPU? I'm certain that they are kind of mirroring your spirit, reflecting your kind of your motives and your inspirations. But you also said that there are people of various walks of life. So maybe talk to us a little bit about your team and the actual workplace.
Okay, great. So our executive director, I'll start with Mira Nagaz, is a woman whose mother is Jewish, whose father is Christian. She's married to a Muslim. She is herself not a Muslim. And she comes to us from a long history of nonprofit management. She's incredibly passionate about the mission of this work, and runs the organization, leads the organization with so much excellence and professionalism. We have a network of more than 40 scholars from all backgrounds that it's multidisciplinary, in some way work on American Muslim issues, but from a lot of different angles, everything from mental health to organizational development to sociology on Islamophobia. And then we have a small team of just our staff, our product research, our project managers, our outreach people, our communication people, all kinds of backgrounds. What makes it so easy to come to work every day is honestly just how dedicated, how passionate every single person is. It's like when you lose some of that drive, someone else will inspire you to come back to it, because people are just so dedicated to the mission at ISPU. The other thing I really love about working at this organization specifically is that there just really isn't any drama. Alhamdulillah, mashallah, please God, let this keep on going. I mean, everywhere, it's hard to have, everyone who's worked anywhere in the world knows that this can sap your energy. It can waste your time when there's like internal sabotage and drama and people trying to, politics, and to have that not there is like such an advantage. So I feel very blessed, and I'm very excited and passionate about feel very privileged to get to do this work every day.
So kind of building on this theme of diversity, what type of outcomes and implications does your research and the ISPU's work have for interfaith spaces? Obviously, that's something that I'm passionate about. So like maybe talk to us a bit about those outcomes and potential impacts, and then maybe some of your experiences with the multi-religious community.
Well, one thing that comes out so clearly in the research is that Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry, is a threat to every single American. And I say that with not sort of like in a theoretical way, but actually literally it is a threat to every single American who cares about freedom and safety in America. So how does it impact interfaith spaces? We all have skin in this game. We all have to work on this. And as a Muslim community, we can't feel isolated. We can't feel alone in this. It is not just a Muslim problem. It's an American problem that we just happen to be the canaries in the coal mine. We're the first to feel it, but the toxic climate is hurting everybody. So I think that's one of the most important outcomes and implications, is it matters to interfaith relations because it's an issue that every single one of us is being impacted by. So Islamophobia, first, just it is a predictor of anti-Semitism. When one goes up, the other one goes up, and it's very clear now. That used to be a controversial finding. Now it's like the most obvious thing in the world. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are very linked. It's also very linked to anti-black racism. Islamophobia makes us scared, right? And we found that in our research, this idea of the neurological impact of fear, well, in numbers, people higher on the Islamophobia index, which is something we developed and measure in the public, are more likely to accept authoritarianism, curtailing our free speech, taking away freedom of association. They're also more likely to approve of attacks on civilians. So those who accuse Muslims of being violent are in fact themselves, the more likely you are to be Islamophobic, the more likely you are to think it's sometimes okay to target civilians violently. And not surprisingly, higher Islamophobia is is linked to approval of anti-Muslim policies, and that's sort of the most intuitive. But it's just bad for America as a whole. Even if anti-Muslim policies aren't something someone might care about, they should care about their right to free speech. They should care about freedom of association. They should care about people being more tolerant of violence, and all of those things are compromised by Islamophobia. So I think that the research makes it just so clear, so crystal clear, that Islamophobia threatens our democracy. And that's how we have to talk about it, because that's actually reality.
And I think too, like one of the things that I've noticed about some of the recent reports that you've published, Islamophobia spikes during election season.
Absolutely, absolutely. Islamophobia spikes around election season. It is a manufactured phenomena. It spikes around election season and does not move after a terrorist attack carried out by a Muslim. So if you think Islamophobia is because of Muslims doing bad things, that's not actually what the data shows. When it spikes is around election season and in the drum up to war. It is a tool of public manipulation, not the organic and reasonable, kind of almost justified reaction to bad Muslims doing bad things.
Continuing on the theme of anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, and its dynamics, what kind of 2 practical steps can all of us leave here tonight with to kind of push back against this evil?
So we've done a bunch of research on what are some of the protective factors against Islamophobia. Okay, so a couple things that come out of that in terms of recommendations is, one, it is more powerful as a protector against Islamophobia to know about Islam as a faith than to even know a Muslim. So knowing a Muslim is a moderate protector, but knowing about Islam is a strong predictor and a protection against Islamophobia. So we have to keep demystifying Islam as a faith. Okay? So that's one. The second is, yes, having, for people to know who Muslims are is still really an important thing, and that has to keep building relationships, building bridges, something we can all do as a community. The third is we have to build coalitions, because Islamophobia is not an isolated phenomena. It is a branch on a bigger tree of bigotry. So it has to be fought in coalition, not in isolation.
Thank you, Dalia. I think we're going to transition to Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you please all join me in thanking Dalia and Craig for this wonderful discussion? This was fun.
Yes.
Thank you, both of you, for lending your voice